I was really happy with this episode. As we guessed, Hvitserk and Ivar ended up actually meeting up, and it was really wholesome and cool to see that duo back together. Ubbe, one of my favorite characters in the show, got a lot of screen time this episode. Not to mention good movement in Roos, and the Harald storyline with Bjorn, his love life, and even an introduction of a new character that looks really cool and I can't wait to explore more of. So yeah, one of the strongest episodes of the whole season, and next week we're going to get the episode 10, the mid-season finale in the battle, so this mid-season is going to close out really well. So I want to begin with the Iceland storyline. It seems that the settlement has grown quite a bit in the number of residents since we last saw it with Floki. There's far more families, they seem to have more food and infrastructure, they're even going quite out of their way to make these extravagant rituals to invite the new visitors into their settlement. And then we get the shot that got a lot of people excited that looked like it was Floki's silhouette. They were even a bit cheeky as they drawed out the entire scene reveal, keeping him in shadows for as long as possible, with people's reactions being all like surprised and shocked. But we find out that it's not Floki, but rather a new, very interesting character, who we find out was an English monk who now takes the life and name of a wanderer in the Norse world. Now, I didn't notice this at first with the big beard and shaggy hair, but a viewer pointed out this is actually the actor who plays Titus in the HBO show Rome. It's actually quite an old show, but it holds up as one of my favorite of all time, especially when it comes to historical fiction. So now I find it a little bit less surprising than I did initially that he can hold scenes so well. He really grips you into his stories, into the universe. He already feels like a significant part of the Iceland storyline when he's only just been introduced. And it's not only us, the viewer, that are gripped into his stories. Clearly, Ubbe is overexcited with the idea of finding this golden land. We also notice quite clearly that Flatnose is super relieved with the idea of Ubbe not thinking about Floki and about his death, and rather moving on to trying to find this new land. However, he's not quite that lucky, and Ubbe is still thinking about Floki and wants to find him. Now let's move to the birth scene of young Ragnar. I would have liked the scene better if I didn't have to quickly jump on the remote and turn down the sound to stop Torvi from screaming out to all my neighbors. Even with that, it was quite a fascinating scene that we got to see an insight into how primitive the technology is and how dangerous childbirth really was for women in that period. Even the smallest complication in the process could claim the life of the child and the mother. I did really enjoy when we got that moment when Ubbe gave out this kind of like half sleep-deprived, crazed laugh of a new father who was just on the brink of losing his wife right in front of his eyes. But instead of that tragedy, he's now one of the happiest points of his life. Now, the other really important thing that came out of this birth scene was the fact that Ubbe discovers this wanderer isn't who he claims to be, and that his prayers that he was saying were of the Christian god, not their Norse gods. Now, Ubbe's never been as radical about his beliefs as people like Ivar or Floki, and as Torvi pointed out, he himself was willing to convert, in show at least, to be a Christian, to get baptized for the gang that they had in England. In Season 5, we did actually see Ubbe kind of struggle with this identity of having this cross around his neck, even though he did ultimately reject it and give it away to Torvi. He still had that experience, and so he can kind of somewhat understand where this guy is coming from. Ubbe's always had one of the most interesting stories to me, even though he hasn't had that much screen time. I felt he kind of carried Ragnar's curiosity, the dreams of exploring new wonderful lands to face people with different cultures and religions and try to understand them. We haven't got much of that from Ubbe since we last saw him challenge the Danes in Season 5, but from this I'm hoping we get a lot more of it in Part B of this season. Now, the last thing we get in the Iceland storyline for this episode is probably the most important one. The Wanderer tries to convince Ubbe desperately to let him go on the journey with him to the Golden Land and redeem himself in his eyes. He also gives Ubbe some vague ideas of why Floki left, what kind of state he was in, and even tells him that Floki probably knew he was a Christian, which gives us more indication that the Floki storyline and the mystery around him will be more and more involved with his inner conflict between the Norse gods and Christianity. The last Christian named Athelstan that Floki came across, he killed. However, we do know this wanderer is willing to lie to everyone around him, and even when he says he's fessing up to the truth, he was still lying. He said the wanderer he came across was sick, but we had a flashback of him killing him, so the name Athelstan might not really be his. Plenty of intrigue and mystery there for us to unravel in the coming episodes. All in all, I thought Iceland was fantastic, and I cannot wait to see what they do with it in Part B of this season. Now, I've got to pause real quick right here to tell you I'm about to head out on a Viking raid. And if you want to jump on board and share the immense plunder from taking down these heathens, then you got to subscribe to the channel by hitting that big red button. And maybe you can ring-a-ding-ding that bell too. Alright, back to your originally scheduled shenanigans. So at long last, Ivar and Hvitserk are reunited together. With Hvitserk going batshit crazy for the last few seasons, with visions of Ivar having ghosts telling him he has to kill Ivar, it's his destiny, he swears on his arm ring, he goes through all of this crazy chaos because of his paranoia around Ivar, it seemed like it didn't faze him at all when he met Ivar. It seems that the writers decided that him killing Lagertha, stabbing that vision of Ivar, was him metaphorically killing Ivar and the vision of him in his head once and for all. Rather than his destiny actually being to kill the physical brother Ivar, it was to kill the image of Ivar in his head. Or perhaps they're just having Hvitserk put that kind of storyline and fate on hold until later down the season when he gets his wits about him. Now we did notice at first when we saw these shots of them by the riverbank kind of talking to each other that they had quite a bit of distance between them. They've both gone through so much since they last saw each other and have changed heavily as people because of it. But we do see that the director purposely puts the shot of them separated with this distance between them right next to the shot of them both on the boat, huddled together and basically cuddling. Never have they looked more like brothers in the show than right at this moment. When we finally arrive back in Roos, we see that Hvitserk starts to brag to Ivar about killing Lagertha. Funnily enough, even though he's getting better and he's a lot more in shape and cleaned up, he still has that craziness in his eyes. Which, come to think of it, all the characters in the Roos storyline are kind of a bit batshit crazy, even the young kid Igor, so actually he might fit in really well here. Now the strange thing about Hvitserk is he never really cared that much about his mother dying, or avenging her, or really killing Lagertha at all, but suddenly he's claiming all this credit for it and being really spiteful towards her, even though we saw that he was immensely confused and guilty when he first killed her, and he was doing it out of his own madness. And we can even see on Ivar's face how unconvinced and confused he is by that claim. Though I'm sure Ivar's not exactly unhappy with the fact that she's dead. So after what seems like a time skip, Hvitserk seems more cleaned up and prepared, and he gets taken in front of Oleg and his princess. Because Hvitserk doesn't really know much about Oleg, he takes the whole conversation very casually. When Oleg kind of politely asks whether he'll join him on their crusade against Scandinavia, Ivar looks really tense, like, oh my god, this is the moment you need to make sure like you say yes, otherwise you'll be killed off. And Hvitserk's like, I got nothing else to do. Just the sheer casual way he said it was pretty funny. Now Ivar does seem to notice that Hvitserk doesn't seem to react at all to Princess Kjatja. In Ivar's mind and what we can see on screen, she's a perfect identical figure to his ex-wife. But Hvitserk doesn't see the resemblance at all and even calls him crazy, which only confuses us and Ivar even more. Later on, we get to see Oleg and Ivar watch the parade of the army go by. This display of military strength really shows us and Ivar how big of a threat the Roos truly are to Scandinavia. And that's double so when Oleg mentions beforehand that this is only part of the army. Now we got this really ominous speech from Oleg talking about how he wants to crush Bjorn Ironside, King Harald, and their gods. And in my preview breakdown I discussed the implications this means for Ivar and the Viking world, so if you want to see my thoughts on that, then check it out here. Now over in Bjorn's storyline, we see that he's continuing to rely on Erik for military support, for advice, and giving him some quite big responsibilities even though technically he's an outcast. With Bjorn feeling so betrayed from Harald, he really wants to only have people close to him that he can truly trust. And because Erik has to rely on Bjorn's protection for him not to be killed off, he knows he has Erik's support. Now I gotta mention that Bjorn always knows how to lounge in the best possible ways. Whenever he's on the chair or on the ground, he's always got full man spread on. So Erik gets appointed with the job of finding out who these raiders are and why they're in their land. It was quite cool to see this Roos guardsman that we're seeing quite a lot around Oleg finally put into action. They're definitely setting him up as some kind of mini-boss for a character to kill off in the battle to come next episode. In Vikings, it's quite easy to tell if a character is going to be important or not. Just basically see if their head is completely unprotected and they have no armor on whatsoever, then they're probably really important. Like, why would you want to wear this weird, heavy, floppy material on your head that can get in your eyes when you know your plot armor is thicker than Bjorn's brain when it comes to romance? So in the aftermath of the battle, Erik finds the flag of the Roos and reports it to Bjorn. This puts Bjorn in a really awkward situation where he hates Harald with every fiber of his being, but knows he must work with him because this Roos threat and Ivar returning is so large. But these feelings of hatred are quite mutual between both Harald and Bjorn. Harald seems to be finding immense dissatisfaction in his rule as king. In his mind, he imagined that he would become king, the girl that promised that he would marry him if he did would be at his side, he'd be powerful and rich and famous like he had never been before. But instead, he finds himself in this position where his power is not fully recognized, his lords are throwing petty problems at him, and now he's facing this huge threat that came out of nowhere. The whole reason he tries to execute Eric and throw him away is less to do with him being an outcast and more with Harald struggling to come to terms with the idea that he actually has to face this threat and that it actually is real. We know Harald's lands were attacked first and he knew about this threat before Bjorn, but he did nothing the whole time because he didn't want to accept that reality. But luckily for all of Scandinavia, Olaf finally had something intelligent to say. It's going to be a really strange alliance on the Scandinavian side. Both Bjorn and Harald still hate each other, they're only really working together because I guess they have to. We can see how defeated and annoyed Harald is just to admit it. So on both sides of the equation we have unlikely allies who are working against each other, with Ivar planning his own betrayal and backstabbing of Oleg on the Rus side, and Harald and Bjorn clearly feuding out in the open. All of these interlocking and mixing agendas, as well as people's personal feuds and histories, are going to mesh together in one big conflict, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out. There are different paths I want each character to go down, the futures I want them to explore. I want Ivar to head to England, but it's going to be really interesting to see how Vikings gets from point A to point B. Now, I didn't really talk about the Golden Tear and the second wife of Bjorn that much, because one, it's kind of depressing and an annoying storyline, but also it might have some bigger implications around the fate of Bjorn. But I do want to hear your guys' thoughts on this episode. Did you find it as enjoyable as I did? What were your favorite parts of the story? I would love to know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and Skål!